witnessed the death of Major Shaw.
Unrepentant reveals Canada's darkest secret, the deliberate extermination of Indigenous peoples and the theft of their land under the guise of religion. This never-before-told tale is seen through the eyes of a former minister who blew the whistle on his own church after he learned of its murder of thousands of children in its Indian residential schools.
When God is on our side, we can commit any crime. We're absolved individually from that crime by believing that we have a higher sanction. And that's the danger of religion, in that it allows people to do that. It allows them to kill without a shred of conscience.
The church is hiding and the government's hiding. There is a lot of people that died in those places.
The church knows where our children are buried. 50,000 died.
She was standing at the top of the stairs and he kicked her. She went rolling downstairs.
What happened to the thousands of children who died or disappeared while in Canada's Indian residential schools? Why have Canada and the churches responsible for their fate refused to say what happened to them and stayed silent in the face of hundreds of eyewitnesses who claim seeing murders and experiencing obscene tortures in these schools? And why do Native people across Canada continue to die at genocidal levels? Unrepentant dares to pose these questions in the face of denial, cover-up, and attacks from the Government of Canada and its churches.
The Achilles heel here is the issue of the land. How was it gotten? When you look at the mechanics of how the land was taken, it's out and out murder, mass murder.
That's exactly what I feel. There was genocide. The control was taken over when our people started to die.
And they said they're burying another one.
Forced to choose between the truth and his own church that committed these crimes, Reverend Kevin Annett opts for the truth at a terrible personal cost. In a seemingly hopeless battle, Kevin and a handful of Native survivors try to force disclosure out of powerful and murderous institutions. Filmed on location on stolen land where the planned extermination of Native people occurred and is continuing, Unrepentant dares to expose Christian Canada's dark shadow for the first time by exploring one man's struggle to remain true and do justice to his culture's victims.
The reason that we're here is the violation of people, isn't that right?
Children especially.
The violation of children. Now, in light of what happened in Penn State, perhaps people are willing more to hear this story, but this has been going on for hundreds of years.
Yeah, well, not only that, but it's been protected by those in authority for hundreds of years, and that's the nub of the problem.
So tonight's show is about this, the biggest secret in the universe that people refuse to talk about and deal with, and what if we can prove something? Are we willing to charge people and seek some justice? Now, if we're being a little mysterious here, Kevin, can you explain what you've been doing for this past number of years and why it's so important to you?
Almost 20 years. It started for me when I was working as a clergyman on the west coast of Canada, and I began to learn about the crimes that my church at the time had done to Indian children. And for many years I documented those crimes. We eventually got it to the point where the churches and governments were being charged with these things, not as institutions, but only individuals. Although, even though 50,000 or more children died, nobody has ever gone to trial in Canada for the death of one of those children, which I think is significant. But now it's expanded out from that to include the whole issue of how this happens all over the world, how children are expendable, basically. And the rate of child abuse and torture and killing is never subsided. It's a constant malady in every society.
So what are some of the things you've been doing over the past 20 years to help bring this to the surface?
Well, documenting it, working with the survivors of these crimes, getting their stories and their face out in the public so that people know it's a problem, confronting the institutions with protests. We've occupied churches. We made documentary films about this, written books. Finally got the Canadian government to begin to acknowledge certain things, but like I said to you before, there's acknowledging something in theory, and then in practice, is there any practical outcome? In practice, there isn't, because these crimes are continuing and they're unabated.
Well, let's call into play and focus on who the actual aggressors are in this case. You're talking about the Catholic Church. You're talking about nation states. I could understand why you might have a mountain or two to climb here.
Well, the primary perpetrator, yeah, you could say is the Roman Catholic Church historically, but a lot of other churches are involved in this too. It isn't confined
Please,
just to
please,
them.
don't leave anyone out. Let's
Well,
make it plain
the
to
ones
the
I
public
know,
what's going on here.
Church of England, the United Church of Canada, Salvation Army, Baptist Church. I mean, all of the mainline denominations are engaged in trafficking children, abusing them, running institutions where they were went through every torture imaginable. Everything defined as genocide under the UN Convention occurred in these Indian boarding schools. One of the things that we're looking into now is the arrangement churches like the Catholic Church has with adoption agencies. So they get a number of kids that are needed by the adoption agency. The Catholic Church identifies young moms who are pregnant and convinces them to give up their child so they can traffic that baby to the adoption agency for money. I mean, that's a massive industry.
Are you saying that churches are involved in selling and trading of human beings?
Yes, it's called, in Canada, now I don't know what it is in the States, but there's a thing they have in hospitals called the BFA protocol, and that stands for Baby for Adoption. If the local priest, for example, identifies a pregnant woman as having agreed to give up her baby, then as soon as that baby is born, it's whisked away from her. She doesn't get to hold her child, and it's immediately sent to an adoption agency. The woman is given drugs like lactation suppressants. She gets psychologically attacked by being put in a group home where she's convinced that she's an unworthy mother and has to surrender to another family. We've had people who have documented this because it's happened to them. They're presently trying to sue the church and the government for this with about the same success as Native people have had, trying to sue for genocide. So.
Yeah, I could see a direct parallel with that. Well, so many of these people who have been victimized are Native Americans, isn't that right?
Well, in one sense, but this crosses all the ethnic lines and even class lines. It primarily, ethnic minorities are targeted. In the baby trafficking system, of course, a white baby gets more money than a black or a Native baby. But it's part of the whole bigger problem of, like, when you have a society where innocence is, go right back to original sin, that doctrine which formulated Western civilization. The idea is that the earth is cursed, innocence is suspect, children have to be battered into submission, they're not right in themselves, they have to be changed. That breeds all of this stuff. And in a society where the strong take precedence over the weak, who are the weakest in society? Who are going to be the most violated? It's children. And
poor children.
Huh?
Poor children.
Especially, yeah, because they can go missing and nobody cares, just like with an Indian, you know.
My name is Cheryl Squire. I'm a Mohawk, and I'm from the Turtle Clan. I just want to talk a little bit about what happened here and how this all got going and why Kevin was asked to come and help us. People are suffering and living in poverty, and I'm well aware of this because I've been working at the Children's Aid Society for the past 15 years. I see all the effects of the residential schools and how it filters, like, from one generation to another. And there's a lot of other things that are intertwined with this. We asked Kevin to come and help us because he's known to us because of everything he's done for our people. He's been into this for 18 years. I've read his books, I've watched the documentaries that he's made, and Kevin knows a lot about all the abuse that our people have suffered because of the government and the churches. We have proof that we've always heard that they killed a lot of our children here, and we have proof that they have done it. So we know it has to be done properly, so we'll be bringing in trained archaeologists to do more investigating, and I just think that people that did this should be brought to justice.
So we're talking the Anglican Church and the government?
Yes, the churches and the government.
Why do you think they're sitting on the evidence? I know the Anglican Church has boxes of documents about the mushroom they won't release.
Because they don't want our people to know everything they did to us and all the abuse that they've inflicted on us over the years. So, and they're also trying to stop yourself from letting people know that, you know, what they've done to us. it's just insane. Like, you don't murder children and get away with it. And I work every day to protect children, and it just really bothers me that so many of our children have been killed. And nothing's ever been done about it. Like, you read about it, and there's information on it all over the place, but nothing's ever been done about it. So why should these people, the churches and the government and Indian Affairs, we're all in on this as well, why should they get away with killing our children? It's just not right, and something needs to be done about it.
Is that okay if I show this? Like, you want this message to get out to the world, so is it okay if I show this?
Yes, I do. I want the world to know, like, well, what they've done to us, and they're still doing it.
So could you outline for the people watching tonight what your credentials are? It's not as if you could be, anybody can talk about theology and talk about church this and that, but you have credentials in this area.
Well, I got a master's degree in political science. I got my Master of Divinity at the Vancouver School of Theology. I was ordained as a United Church minister in 1990, defrocked in 1997 after I began to bring out all this.
You care to tell us a quick story about a defrocking?
Quick story? Well, I was not ever given a cause for when they threw me out of the church, or even when they defrocked me. The church never has to give a reason, because they're not under the law of the land. They're under their own legal system.
Can you have your own frock? I mean,
I can refrock myself. But
yes.
Yeah.
This is cable television. You can do anything here.
I was going to make frock-off T-shirts. You know, like defrock this kind of.
That's right, frock this.
As a matter of fact, people have talked about defrocking the real villains. There's a group in Ireland that are going to have targeted known child-raping priests. And they've already tried this on one of them. They publicly defrock them. They go into their church and rip off the robes and say, get out of our community.
No kidding. Well,
yeah.
We're going to talk about Europe in just a couple of moments.
Right. Yeah.
After the interview, the initial interview I did with Kevin, he was on his way to Europe. What was going on in Europe, and why were you going there?
A lot's going on there. There's groups, like I mentioned, in Ireland, but other countries. They've united with them, other similar groups, to form this international tribunal into crimes of church and state that I work with in 5 countries now. And they are demanding not just legal action, they want to bring in sanctions against the Catholic Church. They want clergy licensed as public servants, so that if they harm a child, they lose their license, they can't be a priest anymore. They don't want one law for the church and one law for everybody else. They're trying to get those changes happening. They invited me. I went to the Netherlands, to Ireland, to Belgium, to try to set up some of these things with them. And you know, they want to go further. They're not satisfied with just going to court and getting a little bit of money, and then the priest who did these crimes goes free, which is what tends to happen, or they get minimal sentencing. You know, it's an amazing political struggle, because it's an issue, like you say, that most people don't want to look at.
No.
Yeah.
Now, this sounds like a process, just like democracy is a process, just like your own life is a process. This seems to be a process, too. Where do you think we are in it, and what would satisfy you?
We're at not even square one, because you know, the main inertia is not what you're up against, because even though they've got all the money in the world, they're extremely vulnerable, these institutions, because they're so guilty and they know it. The biggest problem, like Martin Luther King said, is the majority of people who aren't evil but don't do the good that they know they should be doing on this, the tendency to look the other way or to deny that this is going on because it's so horrible. So I think we're just beginning, and yet at the same time, the power of a few people who are sitting on the truth is enormous. You know, we've shown that already in the changes we're able to bring about in Canada, just by being persistent over the years on this issue. So I think there's a lot of potential on this if people are willing to go beyond even acknowledging a problem to doing what historically is what you need to do to change things and make a stink and get out in the streets and confront, you know, these guilty parties. When we began to occupy churches during masses, that's when we began to get a response from the church. They were terrified. We were getting calls from church lawyers begging us not to occupy any more churches. You know, and sure enough, within a few months of that, the Prime Minister issued an apology for the Indian residential schools after we had begun that civil disobedience. So,
have you shown that to other people? Does that galvanize and grow the movement?
Sure it does, yeah. As a matter of fact, the Irish people were inspired by what we did, and that's when they began to do their church occupations.
So how many countries are we talking about now? There's Canada. Is this country?
Canada, the U.S., Ireland, England, and Italy right now, but there's also groups in Australia and I've lost track actually, but it's growing. You know, thanks to the internet and other things. It's
talk about. Is there a leadership, or is there how does that work?
There's a group in Brussels that has. There's 2 members of the European Parliament who are kind of unofficially endorsing this stuff. So the headquarters of this is in Brussels, but the groups are autonomous. I mean, there's not an overarching group, and they're working on their own because the conditions they face are kind of different in countries. But there's the common denominator that unites everybody is the fact that the Vatican is the target on this because they are the main perpetrator in a lot of these crimes.
That's a tall mountain to climb.
Yeah.
Now, what do you tell people? I know that after running the interview that we did on the Songs of Freedom website, I got email, and one of them, there was detractor sort of email,
Always.
Calling you out. You know, not so much targeting me, but targeting you. What do you tell people who are detractors? And you know, it's easy if you're in a position of power to have detractors come attack you. Hey, we saw it in this country. The whole teabag movement was
oh yeah, well,
was kind of, you know, let's pay people to go in a bus and go to a demonstration and annoy somebody. But how do you deal with detractors and people who
I
come
say
after
everyone's
like
the right
that?
to their opinion, but based it on facts and evidence, not on hearsay and innuendo, which is what it tends to be in my case.
Yeah.
You know, like when I first started this, there was we held a tribunal in 1998, and people out of that tribunal began to say, he's not an Indian, he shouldn't be talking about these things. And I said, well, I'm concerned about what Hitler did, and I'm not a Jew. Does that make a difference? You know, I'm not an Iraqi, but I'm against the war over there, right? The people, somebody once said that in terms of the genocide, white people have to take it on the same way men have to take on rape, because we're the cause. So it's that simple, really. And let's talk about the evidence, not about me, because I'm not the issue. Let's look at the evidence, and what are we going to do as a society about all this stuff?
And I think it's parallel to other revolutions where some of the privileged people have to jump ship, and that's when a tide is turned.
That's right.
You know, you could look at a lot of different movements that way.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm Joel Landy. You're watching Songs of... Where's my camera? That's it. I'm Joel Landy. You're watching Songs of Freedom. I'm here with Kevin Annett, and we're talking about, well, incredibly important things. The whole concept that you can commit crimes for centuries and not be questioned about it. Where do we begin to seek justice? Working with the people as you're working around the world, what do they want? Do they want the same thing, or
well, I can tell you what they don't want. All you ever hear about in the media is money, court settlements, and apologies and money. That's the last thing people ever talk about in survivors' healing circles, where I do a lot of the work. This isn't just with natives. These are, I'll tell you, when I was in Dublin, I was hearing the same stories that you'd hear in a native healing circle. Same kind of tortures and cover-up and murders and mass graves. You know, they ran Magdalene laundries in Ireland where young girls who got pregnant lost their baby, had it taken away and trafficked, and then the rest of their lives they had to work in these Catholic-run sweatshops where a lot of them died. And I was hearing survivors of that talking about the same kind of stuff. Well, the first thing survivors say is, we want justice. We want these people to stand trial. We want the world to know our story, and we want our voice to do more than just have a pat on the head. We want there to be changes so this stuff doesn't happen again. That's not what's going on. What's going on is the lawyers step in and say, okay, we'll give you a bit of money, but you've got to indemnify the churches. And there's an agreement the Irish government worked out with the Catholic Church based on what happened in Canada, where the churches and government got together, legally indemnified themselves. That means created a situation where they could never be held accountable for anything.
Right.
And then they said, okay, we'll give you an apology and money. We're already safe. We're never going to go to jail.
Didn't BP do the same thing?
Right, exactly. That's the corporate plan. You do that, and then you throw a bit of money at the people and say, here, the issue's resolved now. Everybody knows that's a farce. So we have to get the lawyers out of the picture. And that's the first step, you know. It's not about money.
Not about money.
You can't pay for the loss. The destruction of a life has no price tag on it.
So it sounds like these stories that have been kept untold, want to be told, and they're fighting to be heard.
Always. It's a constant struggle. As a matter of fact, a lot of the work I do in Vancouver, where I'm based, is just to keep people's head above the water. People are dying at an enormous rate because of the effects of all of these things they've been through. I mean, at age 4, when you're held down and a dentist drills your teeth without painkiller, you know, when you see friends sterilized, when you see friends murdered and thrown in a ditch, what kind of life are you going to have? You know, most of these people die young. You know, I've done funerals of Native people in their 40s who die of diabetes, suicide. 6 people I've worked with in Vancouver have all either been killed by police, died in hospital, died in prison, or killed themselves. I mean, it's constant because of the effects of these things. So that's why I say people can talk about it ended years ago. It's never ended.
No.
And it's passed on to their
class
kids.
warfare hasn't ended either. And that's what this is, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes.
So that's a word that politically is a hot potato in this country, because we're not supposed to tell the truth. It all ties back to the same thing.
I would have loved to have seen the perpetrators severely punished for all of this. And I would have, the greatest thing I would want to see is the Church of England get barred from practicing in Canada. That, to me, would be what I would love to see.
Why do you think the churches are not being held accountable right now for this?
Because they're all part of the system. They're all in it together, and the government will cover up for them. They'll cover up for the government.
What do you think of the TRC? The Truth and Reconciliation Commission?
It's a bunch of nonsense. The people that perpetrated all of this all go scot-free, and fewer people might tell their story, but what the hell for?
So what's next? What's next for you? What's next for this movement?
I think this is giving me personally and other people a chance to reevaluate everything about our society and ask fundamental questions about how can this be going on? And we need answers that go beyond Band-Aids, simply saying, you know, we get the right legislation, we get the right people in there, and things will be better. It's reflecting a fundamental way we look at ourselves in the world, and all of that's got to change. So, if anything, this should make people more, not just radical, but I think it's a spiritual battle, for want of a better term. It's we have to reinvent ourselves. So, for example, activating people in the community to say, when we know there's child rape going on in church, we take action. We don't wait for the police, because the police have an agreement. Like in the Sandusky case, it's actually a law in Pennsylvania. A child has to be raped 10 or 15 times before the police will intervene.
15 times?
Before a police will intervene. That means it's up to the people in the community.
Is that written down somewhere, 10 or 15 times?
It's an accepted practice, and as you mentioned, it could be because the DA thinks that they wouldn't get a conviction before then or something, but and because of the political pressure and the church brings to bear all the time, not for this stuff not to be looked at, but if, you know, we owe it to our children to protect them, regardless of what the police or courts are going to do. And when they don't act, it's a long tradition in America and common law countries to say then we deputize ourselves to protect ourselves, perform citizens' arrests on these priests, and ban them from our communities. Those are the kind of steps people are going to have to take to really protect our children.
That takes a lot of courage.
And organization and sacrifice. And that's what the Civil Rights Movement did. That's what every movement in this country ever did to get results. You had to go against the stream. Don't forget, the Civil Rights Movement had to break the law. We're standing on the law. They're the ones breaking it. We're standing on international law that says when, and this is, look up the International Criminal Court Rome Statute, Clause 25. It says that when citizens are, their own governments or organizations are engaged in crimes against humanity, which these things are, you have an obligation not to pay taxes or financially support those bodies. American taxpayers fund the Vatican.
Wait a minute. A lot of people don't know this. You're educating a lot of people right now. What do you mean funding the Vatican?
A thing called a financial concordat. It's an agreement between the Vatican and various nations. Our sources have shown that the U.S. is one of the governments that has a secret concordat with the Vatican, whereby a certain percentage of taxpayers' money is funneled directly to the Vatican Bank. Apparently it's done through the Defense Department, because there's been a long relationship between the Vatican, the CIA, and the military going back to the early 80s.
Wait a minute. So we talk about a separation of church and state in this country, but you're saying there's no separation of church and military? Is that what you're saying?
No, yeah, because the Vatican is heavily invested in the arms industry. And this has been well documented.
That sounds upside down on the face of it, but...
Not really, not when you know the beast you're dealing with.
I guess you know more than I do, yeah.
No, well, I mean, this is out there. You just have to find the information. So, I mean, you're dealing with a massive corporation with a lot of complicity in all of these things. And the U.S. government is expecting every citizen listening to this to commit a crime against humanity by funding institutions that are guilty of those crimes. Under the international law, you're obligated not to pay taxes to that kind of government. Just like the illegal war they're waging in Iraq, or the Canadians in Afghanistan. Those are the crimes that we tried the Nazis for at Nuremberg, waging a war of aggression against a non-belligerent nation. They weren't tried for genocide at Nuremberg, interestingly enough. The Nazis were never accused of genocide. They were accused of waging a war of aggression, which is what we're doing. So, under every legal precedent, we have the right to refuse taxes on a legal ground so that we don't collude with a crime against humanity, which is funding these church organizations, for one thing.
You're watching Songs of Freedom. My name is Joel Landy. This is Kevin Annett, and I'm learning a lot tonight. I hope you are. So what could you tell our viewers in terms of, you can get more involved with us by doing what?
Check out websites, itccs.org. International Tribunal into Crimes in Church and State, itccs.org. Also hiddennolonger.com. That gives you a lot of evidence about stuff we've been talking about. Also, in early April, we are planning a teach-in in Harlem. Collier Clark, who is a Green Party candidate for state senator, is planning with community groups a whole week of teach-ins where we're going to talk about these issues, mobilize the community, hold protests and vigils at various churches in New York. So I'll be back in early April. If people want to be involved in this, write to me, hiddenfromhistory1@gmail.com.
Okay, and we'll be putting that up on the screen so people...
Thank you.
Is there anything else you want people to know before we start rounding it out tonight?
Well, I know there's a lot you should know, but I think starting with that information and recognizing that we have a personal responsibility to protect our children. It's that simple, because if we don't have a future. And that's the highest law, the protection. That's always been the highest law for the human race, the protection of the next generation. You know, because it's tied up with the protection of the earth and our civil liberties. You know, if we don't protect that, those are sacred essentials, then we don't have a society, really. And so I would encourage people to realize that it's up to each one of us to do that and not to wait for the experts or some great force that's going to come in. We are the power.
All right. Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Be well. You're watching Songs of Freedom. Good night.